Every night and every morn, some to misery are born. Every morn and every night, some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to sweet delight, some are born to endless night. We are led to believe a lie when we see not through the eye, which was born in a night to perish in a night, when the soul slept in beams of light. God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night. But does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day the random and burdensome toil of mundane life, juxtaposed to an enduring and transcendent self? All through history, through our great religious and philosophical traditions, there's been an idea of an eternal soul, something ineffable about us, which exceeds us. This idea that there is something about us, something core to who we are and why we're here, but something that somehow precedes us and yet will also endure after us. In the age of science, we have left all this behind. The cognitive revolution has put meat on the bone of a more recent idea that there is no mystical element of who we are, but rather that all the mental wonders of human ability are rooted in basic electrochemical processes. The foundation of these processes may be as remarkably simple as their elaboration in living biological organisms is complex and bewildering. Still, in a very real sense, we are meat robots. Our actions are generated by computational algorithms, molded over evolutionary time to behave in certain ways in relation to cues from our environment. Just as the most ancient nervous systems evolved to move their organisms away from danger and toward reproductive and life-sustaining opportunities, human brains, which are just highly complex nervous systems, are just elaborated examples of the same processes, driven by the same motives. Some people have found this an inspired vision that helps us understand so much which had previously seemed mysterious through a naturalistic lens, which explains the world without recourse to mystical or supernatural explanations. Those of a more mystical bend object, though, that this vision of complex meat robots leaves something unexplained. And that unexplained thing is precisely this feeling, this experience of yet something more. Something that doesn't seem to be able to be explained by organic processing units responding to environmental input with electrochemical responses, generating muscular movements that produce action and so behavior. Those on the other side of this argument reply that this ineffable sensation, this experience of possessing an eternal soul which extends beyond our embodied self, is a kind of illusion. It may be the necessary illusion of an evolved psychology, perhaps a kind of sustaining self-deception that allows us to keep functioning effectively as an organism, which is of course necessary for the perpetuation of our genes. Any claim to a substantive soul, though, beyond that, they say, is merely an appeal to the supernatural. Well, this video changes all that. In watching this video, you are participating in an historical moment of epic proportions. In this video, the mystery is explained. This video explains the foundation of your eternal soul. I know some of you are leaping from your chairs with shouts of junk science and pseudoscience and the like, and I don't fault your skepticism. It's justified and well-earned. But if it's a commitment to science that animates you, surely the whole point of science is to weigh all the evidence. So please, kindly I ask you, return to your seat and hear me out. This claim for an eternal soul gene is not a mystical or religious one, though it may cast light upon the conditions that give rise to such beliefs. On the contrary, your eternal soul, as I'll explain it here, is thoroughly naturalistic. It is, in fact, a fact of biology. Indeed, my claim here will be that your eternal soul, that essential defining feature of who you are, which both precedes your existence and lives on beyond your death, is precisely, as a naturalistic explanation would expect, rooted in your genes. Yes, I will demonstrate to you in this video that in the nomenclature of our time, there is an eternal soul gene. I expect an initial reticence from those on both the mystical and naturalistic side of the argument. For those on the mystical side, I say, what motivates you? Do you want to solve a mystery which you do not believe science has adequately addressed? Or are you merely determined to maintain mystery in the face of science's extraordinary powers of explanation? Well, if it's the latter, nobody can please you who doesn't simply agree with you, so there's really no point talking about any of this with you. But if you're of the former persuasion, you might find what comes here fascinating. For those on the naturalistic side of the argument, I appreciate your reluctance. But surely the purpose of science is not to prove the mystics wrong, but rather to explain the world. If science winds up proving that the mystics intuited something true about the world, which naturalists long dismissed or misunderstood, the correct response is to tip our cap to the heuristic value of intuition and get on with the science. So, allow me at this time to swear a solemn oath to those on all sides of this discussion that every scientific claim I make for the next 25 minutes will be completely true, grounded in the very best of empirical science. And, as we'll see, this goes some very long distance in explaining the human experience of an eternal soul, without resorting to explaining it away as a mere epiphenomena or self-delusion. Since developments in cognitive science have been in the trenches of these debates for half a century now, let's begin with an understanding of the brain. What does it do? And even more importantly, how does it work? How does it do what it does? A fact that seemed obvious from evolutionary principles, that the biological matter of the human brain has to have been molded by fitness-enhancing selective forces that deal with the challenges we face as living organisms, has been confirmed in recent decades with the development of fMRI technology, allowing us to see in real time the functional processes of the brain at work. Everything we feel, think, and do is generated by our brains, and we now can see that generation in action. We know that there are specific areas of our brain that recognize faces, and indeed, by looking at a brain lit up on an fMRI scan, we can know whether a person is looking at a face or a landscape. Furthermore, even brain functions which we think of as rooted in ephemeral, subjective aspects of our unique personal identity, like the processing of information by means of our values, turns out to be deeply ingrained in the evolved structure of our brains. A fascinating example of this is revealed by the trolley car problem. An old thought experiment which seemed to reflect an inconsistency in our ethical systems, the trolley car problem entailed the following comparison of scenarios. In the first case, you're told that there's a trolley car rolling out of control along a set of tracks which will lead it to crash into and kill 5 people who are working further on down the track. You, however, have an opportunity to pull a switch to change the direction of the trolley, turning it onto another track, though along that track, there is one person working who will be killed. So the challenge is, do you simply allow destiny to take its course and let the 5 die, or do you take a hand in fate, knowing that you are dooming one person to death by your own very actions, yet at the same time saving 5 other lives? It's a conundrum. In a very real sense, you would be committing utilitarian murder, killing one person to save 5. This is an ethically difficult problem, but it turns out that most people are willing to take this action of pulling the switch to change the track and redirect the trolley. The trolley car problem, though, continues with a second scenario. This one begins much the same way. An out-of-control trolley car is coming down the track where it will kill 5 people along the track. Again, you have the opportunity to save the 5 people, but the conditions are different. This time, you're up on a bridge above the track, and there's a very large person also up there with you. If you push this very large person off the bridge, he would land on the tracks. If the fall didn't kill him, the trolley car would. But the trolley is small enough, and he is large enough, that it would stop or at least slow down the trolley sufficiently for the other 5 people to escape harm. So, do you push him off the bridge? It turns out that while many people are willing to pull the switch to kill 1 to save 5, only a very small number of respondents are willing to push the man off the bridge to kill 1 to save 5. For many ethicists and philosophers, this apparently contradictory set of preferences revealed a profound inconsistency in our moral or ethical standards. If the utilitarian calculus that it's best to sacrifice 1 life to save 5 is true in one case, well, it should be true in both cases. In some way, we've ethically failed when we make the distinction that many respondents in these trolley car experiments seem to have made. However, the application of fMRI scans to those undertaking the trolley car challenge reveals that something much more complicated than mere ethical inconsistency is at work. It turns out that when people are contemplating their answer as to what the right thing to do is, or what they're willing to entertain doing, different parts of their brain is activated. So it turns out that our differing responses to the 2 trolley car scenarios is not a failure of ethical consistency, but is rather environmental input being processed by different areas of the brain. Each evolved to solve very specific kinds of evolutionary problems. To the ethicists, the 2 trolley car scenarios may have been the same thing with minor differences in the details. For our evolved species, they were not the same thing, but rather activated different cognitive processes, probably for very good evolutionary reasons. I hope at this point, then, I've persuaded you that our brains compute the information of the world along evolved cognitive pathways, insofar as such computation generates fitness-enhancing interaction with the world. But now we have to understand more clearly, what exactly is it I'm referring to when I talk about cognitive pathways? Is this mere metaphor, or does it describe something more tangible? How does the brain actually do all this? Nervous systems, including the human brain, are composed of special cells called neurons. These nerve cells have 2 main types of branches coming off their cell bodies. Dendrites receive incoming messages from other nerve cells. Axons carry outgoing signals from the cell body to other cells, such as a nearby neuron or muscle cell. Interconnected with each other, neurons provide lightning-fast communication. A neuron communicates with other cells through electrochemical pulses when the nerve cell is stimulated. Within a neuron, the pulse moves to the tip of an axon and causes the release of neurotransmitters, chemicals that act as messengers. Neurotransmitters pass through the synapse, the gap between the two nerve cells, and attach to receptors on the receiving cell. This process repeats from neuron to neuron as the pulse travels to its destination, a web of communication that allows you to move, to think, and to feel. So these tiny cells, neurons, through nothing more than electrochemical exchanges, can produce a network which somehow gives rise to experiences of self-identity. This network of electrochemical reactions create a cogent entity that infuses an organism with integrity and motivation. Aside of the mechanics of a brain's purely cognitive functions, this network of electrochemical reactions constitutes something with its own sense of identity, whether it's conscious of that identity, like humans are, or not. Even the markedly smaller brain of, say, a bird, or even the cruder nervous system of an ant, still operates in the world with what might be understood as a consciousness of its own body's dimensions and potentials. Though there's of course no evidence for such a consciousness actually existing, it isn't really necessary. This operative awareness is intrinsic to the nature of the electrochemical network itself. That neurons can constitute this kind of electrochemical communicative network seems quite astounding. Yet this is only scratching the surface of what's possible for such a network. As remarkably tiny as neurons are, they themselves only exist because of the remarkable activity of even smaller, more remarkable units that make us humans, and indeed all life, even possible. These still smaller units are what we call genes. The history of genes, and our own gradual coming to understand them, are both remarkable stories, which would sidetrack our investigation too far. But there are some fundamentals about genes that we need to have clear before we can begin to understand the remarkable story of the eternal soul gene. And a remarkable part of that story of the gene is that we knew it existed before we'd ever seen it. It wasn't until the 1950s that James Watson and Francis Crick published a model of the double-stranded DNA molecule whose paired nucleotide bases indicated a compelling hypothesis for the mechanism of genetic replication. And it wasn't until the 1970s that Walter Fiers and his team were the first to determine the sequence of a gene, that of, and excuse my pronunciation, bacteriophage MS2 coat protein. Yet in the early 20th and even back in the 19th century, it was clear that genes, or something that did what we now know that genes do, had to exist. Famously, Gregor Mendel had shown that the offspring of pea plants exhibited traits that indicated some kind of specific unit controlling development had to be inherited from the parent plants. The effects of genes revealed their existence before we could identify or explain or see them. This is important insight to keep in mind as we move forward. Another important thing to understand about genes is what Richard Dawkins famously characterized as their selfishness, the selfish gene, as he phrased it. Contrary to what some people misunderstood him to be saying, it isn't that our genes make us selfish, or even that there's some gene for selfishness. Dawkins' characterization rather invokes a metaphor of the gene having in fact one very specific and particular selfish desire, the desire to be immortal. And the way that genes may be immortal, at least in principle, is by successfully being passed on from generation to generation. Parent to child, who becomes a parent, and so on. Certainly, different genes have had different degrees of success in this pursuit of immortality, but consider what's possible. A case in point, the oldest known functioning gene codes for an enzyme called glutamine synthetase. It creates the amino acid glutamine from glutamate and ammonia. This enzyme is crucial to how cells make protein and remove excess nitrogen. Every living thing uses this same gene. As a consequence, natural selection has preserved it unchanged for more than 2 billion years. Now, that's immortality success. The idea of the selfish gene, then, is a heuristic for the fact that our genes compose the entirety of our structure and behavior. Of course, that structure and behavior is influenced by environmental conditions, but environmental conditions only have an effect on our development to the degree the genes effectively process the informational inputs of the relevant environmental cues. To the degree, then, that any specific structure and behavior allows us to survive long enough and successfully enough to attract a mate, allowing us to sexually reproduce, our genes can be seen as selfishly building us in such a way as to ensure their own immortality. It's in this sense that we can think of genes as selfish. From a purely technical perspective, genes turn out to be themselves products of electrochemical reactions that produce the proteins which are the foundation of life. They're composed of nucleotide base pairs which combine to generate chemical chain reactions involving the production of codons, amino acids, and proteins. Sets of 3 nucleotides produce a codon. The codons create the amino acids, and the amino acids create the proteins, and hence we have life. However, genes are subject to mutation, which can cause the chemical reaction of genes to be lost. By a simple copying mistake, the codon CTC could be accidentally changed to CAC. This could have catastrophic effects on the immortality of the gene, to say nothing of the well-being of the organism with the gene. That would be you and me. Yet, it turns out that a great many genes have a remarkable redundancy built in, so that different codons, even after being mutated, can produce the necessary amino acid to get the protein necessary for the gene to be effective. There are 20 known amino acids, but 64 possible codons, and it turns out that the selfish genes have figured out how to put all that excess capacity to good work. Those selfish genes have been around for a long time. They've come up with all kinds of clever tricks. For our purposes, it isn't necessary to explain all the details of these remarkably complicated processes, though it is interesting to note that the very existence of a gene depends upon electrochemical processes akin to those we saw that constituted our brains. However, this is only the beginning of understanding the striking similarity of these two biological processes. For while we thought for a long time that there was a gene responsible for all our structural and behavioral traits, this has turned out not to be quite true. In the early days, prior to the mapping of the human genome, experts predicted that our DNA would be composed of hundreds of thousands of genes. There seemed to be just so much work that needed to be done. It turned out, however, that there were not nearly that many genes in the human genome. In fact, while estimates still continue to differ, it appears at the moment that the best guess is that we have around 20,000 genes. Oh, this is a far cry from what was originally anticipated. How, though, can it be that such a small number of genes can give rise to so many complex human traits of structure and behavior? This mystery has been solved by a deeper understanding of genetic interaction. Polygenic inheritance, pleiotropy, and epistasis are manners in which genes interact. Pleiotropy occurs when one gene influences two or more seemingly unrelated phenotypic traits. Epistasis is the phenomenon where the effects of one gene are modified by one or several other genes, sometimes called modifier genes. In polygenic inheritance, a trait is produced from the cumulative effect of many genes, in contrast to monogenetic inheritance, wherein the trait results from the expression of only one gene. What all these processes have in common is that, in contrast to the still common assumption that most human traits arise from one particular gene, located at one particular place in a chromosome, in fact, we, as an amazing array of structural and behavioral traits, are actually the product of numerous genes interacting with each other. And how do these genes engage in this interaction? Much like the neurons of the brain, through electrochemical reactions. It remains common nomenclature even among geneticists and biologists, to say nothing of the pervasiveness of such an idea in the general public, to refer to there being a gene for a trait, an intelligence gene, a gay gene, a morality gene. In reality, though, for the vast majority of our traits, the term gene is now a shorthand referring to a network of electrochemical reactions among multiple genes. If this description strikes you as interestingly similar to how we came to understand how the brain works, you're on the right track, but only beginning to scratch the surface of this remarkable phenomenon of the eternal soul gene. To better understand what we're discovering, consider the old story of the blind man trying to identify the elephant. It's an old Buddhist parable and tells the story of what we might call constrained information. It goes like this. A group of blind men heard that a strange animal, called an elephant, had been brought to the town, but none of them were aware of its shape and form. Out of curiosity, they said, well, we must inspect and know it by touch, of which we are capable. So they sought it out. And when they found the elephant, they groped about it. In the case of the first man, whose hand landed on the trunk, he said, oh, this being is like a thick snake. For another one, whose hand reached its ear, it seemed like a kind of fan. As for another man, whose hand was upon its leg, he said the elephant is a pillar, like a tree trunk. The blind man who placed his hand upon its side said the elephant is a wall. Another, who felt its tail, described it as a rope. The last felt its tusk, stating that the elephant is that which is hard, smooth, and like a spear. None of the blind men, strictly speaking, were wrong, yet neither were any of them actually right. The reason being that each only had a glimpse of a smaller part of a much larger picture. The errors of interpretation they'd made needed that larger picture to be corrected. Might this be precisely the situation in which contemporary geneticists have found themselves up until now? Let's try a little thought experiment. Imagine a huge network of interconnected things, say genes, for instance. This complex web of connections might be visualized as a giant ball floating in space in a room of darkness. Now, let's imagine that there are people, say geneticists, who are trying to look at it. but each one can only see it by way of a very narrowly focused flashlight. The narrow beam of each flashlight falls upon a particular spot on this giant ball of connected genes. And each geneticist says, "Ah, look, I found interconnected genes." Maybe the effect of the interconnections for any one gene is pleiotrophic or polygenic, or both in different relations to other genes. But each one of the geneticists has discovered the dynamic interconnections under the scrutiny of the area illuminated by the beam of their own flashlight. Like the blind men examining the elephant, none of them, though, sees outside the narrowly lit area of their own beam. It brings to mind the old joke. A woman walking down the street one night sees a man on his knees under a streetlight searching on the ground. She inquires about the situation, and he explains that he's lost his car keys. The woman, a generous person, joins in the search. After a long while, though, the futility of the search takes its toll, and she asks the man, "Are you sure you dropped your keys here?" To which he replies, "Oh no, I dropped them down the street over there." Perplexed, the woman asks, "Well, why then are you searching over here?" To which he replies, "The light is better here." Is it possible that until now, our geneticists have been fumbling about with narrow flashlights in a darkened room, simply looking where the light was best? Is it possible that what we've noted as trait-specific genetic interactions are fleeting glimpses of, in fact, a much greater, more cohesive, more complex network of genetic dynamism? Is it possible that there's a vast, almost brain-like electrochemically connected entity inhabiting our genome? It turns out that we finally know that the answer is yes to all of these questions. By way of exhibit number 1 on behalf of my case, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Matthias Sandorne, a pioneer in the cutting-edge field of genomic kinetics. So, Matthias, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, can you tell me about your methodological breakthrough?
We've used a relatively new technique of genome-wide association studies, which have been made possible by the emergence in recent years of incredibly cheap computational power to create immense overlaps and map genetic data. It is the same technology which has allowed us to identify previously unrecognized patterns and relations within the genome. Rather than drilling down into the genome, our approach has been to accumulate the greatest possible degree of detail at the level of dynamic interaction among the genes.
So we could say you've thrown the greatest degree of light yet upon the full integrity of the genome?
Yes, exactly. We have understood the genome not as a set of discrete local interactions, but as a full spectrum system.
A rather larger beamed flashlight this one is using. Well, we're all dying to know. What have you discovered?
Our researches reveal that within the genome of each of us, as individuals, there is a kind of cohesive entity, an articulated delineation of genetic connections that permeate our genome. This network, if you like, operates within each of us, constantly, holding together a kind of genetic identity.
Well, what holds it together?
The very same chemical reactions, acting as communication signals, which we've long known to be fundamental to genetic interaction in widely acknowledged processes like pleiotropic and polygenic interactions. We've merely discovered that these localized networks of genetic effect are themselves networked together into this larger entity.
So you make it sound like a kind of brain of the genome.
That is not a terrible metaphor. Of course, the brain has trillions of neurons, while your genome only has tens of thousands of genes. So the entity within the genome cannot process information with anything like the speed or capacity of the brain. Still, there is an interesting parallel. The genetic chemical network cannot compute like a brain, but how it does resemble the brain is in having a self-identity. Even very simple-brained organisms, incapable of what we think of as consciousness or reason, seem to have a sense of self-identity, a sense of their own integrity. We might even think of this as a sense of their place in a continuity within their lineage.
Did I hear that correctly? Is he talking about a sense of self or being that precedes and underpins any conscious feeling of self? Right there in our genes? So this is a remarkable claim.
Well, the scientific evidence is quite clear.
You're saying that this genetic entity, like a kind of electrochemical ghost in the machine of our biological being, provides us some primordial sense of self?
Yes, exactly. And to reiterate, this is not merely a sense of our own self as an individual, but perhaps even more importantly, as a continuation of a lineage. It connects our identity to past and future generations of our lineage.
It can be inherited?
Oh, certainly.
But genetic mutations happen constantly. Surely they would disrupt it from generation to generation.
This is possible, but happens less than you might assume. Certainly, mutated genes can arise, which generate different chemical effects. However, it's quite amazing the degree of redundancy protection our genes have evolved. Many transcription errors in the production of codons still allow genes to continue to produce the same amino acids necessary to produce the proteins that generate the evolutionary traits that have perpetuated those genes. This genome-level entity we're discussing, this perpetuated sense of cohesive identity, too, has a great deal of redundancy built into it, so that even when genes change enough to produce disadvantageous fitness effects, they may still allow for the continued generation of this entity within the genome.
So, this entity, this capacity for cross-lineage self-identity, at least in principle, has the potential to be eternal?
Certainly. Much as Dawkins famously described genes as striving toward immortality, there is an immortality potential to this chemically generated entity within our genome. In theory, provided the lineage in question found a way of leaving Earth by the time our sun burned out, if we could find a way to travel across the universe, chasing the time horizon, yes, at least in theory, within any one of us, this genetic entity could well be eternal.
An eternal entity which underpins our primordial sense of self. It sounds like what you're describing is, well, the soul.
In all likelihood, down through the ages of human experience, as humans have continually felt the presence of something ineffable about themselves, something that defined them and that they believed would live forever, this presence that some would call a soul, yes, I believe it was precisely the presence of this primordial entity, this network of electrochemical connections buried deep in their genome that they were experiencing.
So, you've in fact discovered the genetic basis of the eternal soul.
Yes, using the casual nomenclature of the discipline, it could be said that we have discovered the eternal soul gene.
The eternal soul gene. It turns out the eternal soul does exist, and it requires no supernatural explanation. But it also turns out that those of religious experience who've asserted that there was something eternal within us, that which was rooted deeper into us than even our capacity for reason, were far more right than many of a scientific disposition were willing to concede. Spiritual practices like prayer or meditation perhaps concentrated our being sufficiently to feel what was in our genes, long before we could ever explain it. If so, it would seem to have turned out that the great debate between the theists and the atheists, the spiritualists and the naturalists, has resulted in more of a saw-off than either would have imagined. The eternal soul gene. How do you like that? Oh, but After this remarkable journey, upon which we've taken you into nether regions previously unimagined and unexplained, and that I'm willing to bet were quite unanticipated by any reasonable expectations you may have had, there's still one more important question that we need to ask our Dr. Sandorni before we can conclude. So, Matthias, is everything you've said here today true?
Truly?
Truly true?
No.
No?
No.
Well, then why did you say it?
It was in the script you gave me.
You're just an actor reading lines?
Exactly.
Your name isn't really Matthias Sandorni.
No.
Well, then who are you?
I'm your son. You asked me to perform in this this show you're creating.
Yes, so you are. And this whole interview has in fact been a charade, hasn't it?
Yes.
Well, I guess that really is pseudoscience, isn't it? I suppose I've been misleading you a little. In fairness, though, I did tell you that every scientific claim I make for the next 25 minutes would be completely true, grounded in the very best of empirical science. But those 25 minutes ended about 7 minutes ago. What? You're not constantly checking the time while watching a video? I'm shocked. Yes, I concede. We had a little fun with you. And hopefully you had a little fun with us. I proposed to you earlier to think of this eternal soul gene idea as a thought experiment. It just turned out to be a somewhat more elaborate one than I'd let on. And after all, the idea at the core of this thought experiment isn't completely crazy. It could be true. Perhaps you might think of this video as a rather theatrical posing of a hypothesis. And hypothesis posing is really what good science is all about. However, there's another lesson to take away from our little video game. Scientific ideas come from scientific experiments. And finding out about those experiments is best done by looking at scientific journals. As narratively palpable as it may be, you never get actual science from scientific journalism. So my suggestion, as we bid adieu, is to be cautious in the future about getting your science from newspapers or television or, God forbid, documentaries.